Hallo zusammen, herzlich willkommen zur 12. Episode im Swiss Musclecast. Ich hoffe, ihr seid alle wieder gut in die Gyms gestartet. Ich hoffe, euch geht es allen gut. Wie ihr seht, heute sind wir wieder zu vierten am Start und zwar mit einem Special Guest, mit dem niemand geringerem als dem AJ Morris. Und wie ihr vielleicht alle schon wisst, am AJ seine Deutsch-Skills sind nicht so schlecht, sage ich jetzt mal, aber wir werden auf Englisch wechseln. Also ich hoffe, es ist für euch alle okay, dass die Episode unsere erste auf Englisch wird sein. Und von dem her ab jetzt English only. And for those of you who don't know AJ, who are you? What are you doing? Yeah, let us hear a short but nice and sexy introduction of you.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate you guys having me on the podcast. I've been following what you guys have been doing, and it's looking great. So keep it up. I know a podcast is hard to run, sometimes hard to stay consistent with, but especially when people have different schedules. But you're doing a great job. So it's a pleasure to be here. And in terms of my German skills, they are not great. I've commented on a few of my German-speaking clients' Instagram posts, and I think the comedy thread that follows just shows how poor my translator skills are. So yeah. First of all, I'm 24 years old. I'm primarily a coach. That's what most people will know me for. I run Team MBM coaching, which is basically mainly coaching natural, drug-free athletes in their off seasons or to the stage. That's what we prioritize in now. In the past, I've come from a background of one-to-one personal training, just general population. In the gym, did that for 2 years, and then gradually built the online sort of coaching side of things, and been doing that for pretty much the past 5 years. And it's just slowly morphed into coaching purely physique competitors, which I love. It's just my passion. I absolutely love taking people to the stage. I love bodybuilding as a whole, but drug-free bodybuilding is definitely where my passion really lies. And I've just been a huge part of the drug-free bodybuilding community for pretty much ever since I competed. I've wanted to be at every show. I've wanted to be at the Worlds. I've wanted, just even if it's spectating, I've just wanted to be involved in it in some shape or form. I've been very lucky enough to be a small part of the UK DFBA, which is our, pretty much one of the biggest UK federations for drug-free bodybuilding, and sort of playing a role, helping with the social media, and just sort of sitting as a background role within that fed. Because eventually, this is something that I've not really talked about much, but eventually I see, once I'm done with my competitive career, I'd love to play a big role in a federation. I'd like to be someone that was pushing natural bodybuilding in the direction that I see it heading, especially in the UK. So yeah, that's why I speak to like Lee Kemp a lot, and we have a lot of conversations about the sport, and I just love it. So yeah, and as a competitor myself, so I don't just love bodybuilding on the sidelines, I do compete as well. So I just haven't competed in a long time, and it might be even longer at this rate. So the last time I competed was 2017, and I won the UK DFBA British title as a junior, and then won Worlds as a junior as well. So that's my sort of best achievement so far. And I was almost unbeaten as a junior, almost. I did get beaten by one guy called Taf Ameji, who's probably going to be one of the stars of the future. I think he's just got fantastic bodybuilding structure and genetics. So I was quite content to be beaten by him in a way. But yeah, that's pretty much me, guys. And I look forward to the questions that you have.
Thanks for that. First of all, it's a pleasure for us. We feel honored that you join us here. Maybe a follow-up question on that. How did you discover that passion? I mean, how did you first start it, or for what reason did you get into lifting the iron?
Sure. So my background before bodybuilding, before I got into weight training was motorsport, and before that was football. So I played football from the age of about 7, 8, 9 years old, and then my dad, my father was really into motorsport, and I always watched Formula One from about the age of like 2, 3 years old. So I was sort of forced into that direction, but I loved it as well, and I grew up like loving cars and just loving the idea of going fast. And so I got into motorsport when I was 8. I stopped playing football and took up motorsport. And from that point onwards, I just needed something competitive pretty much all the time. And I knew that I needed something at the weekends or something to involve myself in where I knew I was going to come out with a result, like some sort of result-based sport. And I also realized that I didn't massively like team sports. I didn't really like a sport where a lot of other people had a role in where I finished or where we placed, because I'd rather take the heat and be the one that screwed it up or didn't do well. Obviously, it's funny because as parallels, motorsport and bodybuilding have a lot in common because it's one person on the track and it's one person on the stage. But behind that, there's a lot more. So behind the track, there's the mechanics, the team, even your family who are supporting you, especially when you're young. You know, you're not paying for it, your family's paying for it. And in bodybuilding, the parallel is similar. You have a coach, or you have, your family support it or they don't support it. So the parallel is very similar because you're the only one on stage. So I was used to that kind of setup. And I loved motorsport. I still do love motorsport, as a lot of people who follow me on Instagram will know. I really do love Formula One. It's probably one of my, motorsport in general is probably one of the things that I do in the background. I used to switch off away from bodybuilding. And I stopped for one main reason, and that's financial. It's a very, very expensive sport. So I was at the point where I was bridging the gap between competing in karts in the UK and Europe pretty much every weekend to then trying to get into like single seaters or, bottom end saloon car racing, which would just be a huge step and a huge financial jump. Required a lot of sponsorship. I didn't have that at the time. So at that point I was already training, but I was training for the goal of being on track and being fit. So I was very fit because I didn't have some of the finances that other people had to like be on the track more frequently. So I just made myself super fit so that no one else was fitter than me and no one else could like last as long as I could last in a race and keep my performance high, because racing is very physical. A lot of people don't understand that. Top level professional drivers are very fit, very, very fit. They're also very small, but they're, very fit. They're just a different type of fit, right? I was on a scholarship program as well, with the UK Motorsport Organisation, and we went to Silverstone once to do fitness testing. And I remember saying to like that we had like a pull-up test, and they were like, okay, so how many pull-ups do you reckon you could do? They asked everyone before we started, and I said something like, because I was like really light, really lean, I said something like 30 plus. They all laughed and said, there's no chance you'll be doing 30 plus. And then I did like 35, 40 pull-ups. And awesome. They were just like, I was definitely already a step ahead of other people in terms of just nailing that aspect of the sport, which at that age was uncommon, because a lot of people would just have really, really, like, motorsport's weird, just have really rich parents, and then they wouldn't tick all the other boxes. They're really rich parents, go to the tracks every weekend, be very good because they could afford all the best equipment, and would always beat me, but wouldn't ever beat me at something that was free, like a pull-up. Yeah, it's just a really frustrating sport. But anyway, long story short, I stopped. Was already training at the gym, had already built a little bit of muscle. So I decided to just keep building muscle really and stop some of the cardiovascular work that I was doing. So I stopped the cardio work, started just doing more weights, which I loved. And I grew pretty well. I stayed pretty lean initially, just because I'd started from a really lean point and I didn't really know what to eat or how to eat to grow. And then I think when I was like 15, 16, I started buying a few flex magazines from my local supermarket, because I used to work in a supermarket. I worked in a supermarket. It's my first job for 3 years. I did one of my preps at a supermarket as well, my first prep, and it's very difficult to prep and work in a supermarket, especially when you're outside collecting the trolleys in the car park and doing 25,000 steps and, you know, having food focus for the first time, and it's horrendous.
And all the food around you in the market.
Yeah, scanning it. It was just a really, like, I could have got a serious eating disorder in that job, like seriously bad. So I started like buying the flex magazines after I finished work, and then I was reading like the articles on, you know, how to bulk, how to gain weight. So I figured out that I just needed to eat more. And I did. I ate a lot more, and I got pretty chubby, pretty fat. For like reference, I think the highest body weight I hit when I was 17 was 485 pounds. And like, so my heaviest I got into my last off season, this most recent one, was 196. So I was only sort of like 10 pounds off that, and I was just so fat. So I obviously had a lot less muscle. And that was basically how I found my passion for the sport. Was motorsport, led me to bodybuilding, led me to sort of the weight training aspect of things. I think that's a similar sort of process for a lot of people. Is they'll have a sort of a sport that they like when they grow up, and then they'll transition into bodybuilding. You'll get some people that start with just bodybuilding, and usually they're the people that are pretty freaky when they're young, because they've just been like doing biceps every day or chest every day. Unfortunately I didn't have any of that. I wish I did arms every day for ages when I was young, because that would have been so beneficial, or chest every day. I didn't. So. But yeah, that was it really. I could go on for ages about the story and how I found the sport. I could talk for days, but I'll leave it there just so you get actually some more questions in this podcast.
Fantastic, mate. So I'll just have a question for you. Just your thoughts on the standards nowadays. So I think over the last years, like the teen classes and the junior classes got a lot better, and there are some pretty genetic blessed guys. And in terms of that, also, what do you think, which or how big of a role play genetics in this sport? So just go ahead on your thoughts.
Sure. So first part of the question, the teens and the juniors, 100%, and like crazy progression of those two classes. Like shocking muscularity in some of the teenage bodybuilders. You know, Ramon, you're one of the examples there, mate. For sure, the progression of that class is ridiculous. In terms of why I think that's happening and how it's probably a good thing as well, it's just the availability of knowledge. You know, like I said, when I was a teen, even just when I was a teen, which was pretty much a decade ago when I started, there wasn't anywhere near as much information as there is now. There wasn't really many member sites. There wasn't really many podcasts. There was a few. Like if you look back, there was probably a few that would give you a decent amount of information. Brett Freeman was actually running, I think it was Natty Talk Radio back then. It's a really funny story about that Natty Talk Radio actually, that Brett Freeman run. Brett Freeman is the WNBF bantamweight and lightweight champ, by the way. I was listening to that podcast like every day on prep, like listening to all the old episodes, because he wasn't releasing it. And I was listening to them every day in 2017. But I was also chatting to Brett on Instagram and on DMs, and then we met in Boston and like had some photos together and stuff. And it wasn't until like literally about 8 months ago that I realized that that was his podcast and he was running it. I didn't even know it was him.
So good.
I just had no idea. It was just an American accent to me. But yeah, there was some gems on there, but it wasn't like it was in your face. Like now, knowledge is in your face. It's right there. It's readily available and also quite mainstream in the bodybuilding scene. So I think the knowledge has gone up massively, and that's resulted in better physiques on stage, better training, better dieting, better physiques. But also the second point of your question in terms of genetics. So unfortunately, to a lot of people's dismay, bodybuilding is a huge game of genetics. Your genetic potential will ultimately create how you do in the sport. I think the more obvious one that you need to consider is your structure. Like a lot of people don't understand how important structure is, how your bone structure is made up, especially the waist and then the upper body and the clavicles. Like that literally will dictate how your quarter turns, how your symmetry round goes. And a lot of people aren't blessed in those areas, and then as a result of that, they have to make up for it in a lot of muscle in spots that will make their waist and the structure appear better. And you can definitely do that with muscle. And that's where hard work and dedication can beat really good genetics. And I don't think that, like myself, obviously I won a junior title fairly recently up against some people with really good genetics. And the reason behind that, I mean, I've probably got favorable structure and my bone structure is good, but building muscle, I've never been like a crazy freak. I've never been a freak at building muscle. I don't think I ever will be a freak at building muscle, but the way the muscle goes on is fairly favorable when you look at the poses and the flow from the head to the toe, which is why structure is so important. Because a lot of people just think genetics is how big you are. And you're like, they look at someone with huge arms or a huge chest and they're like, oh, he's got crazy genetics, but it doesn't matter if everything else isn't in proportion or balanced. Because, you know, balance is so integral in bodybuilding. If you're not a balanced physique, you're not going to do well. So yes, the jump in the classes is big, but it will mean that bodybuilding is just more competitive in the future, and that other people have to step their game up to then match these physiques that are coming up and that are very, very good. But again, you'll get good years and bad years with bodybuilding in juniors and the teens. Sometimes you'll get a really crazy year where there's loads of people that are very, very good, and then you'll at the other end you'll get a more moderate year where there's not so many good people, and that is just the sort of the juggling aspect of bodybuilding that will always be going on. It's an up and down curve. So yeah, that's the answer to the question, really, mate.
Love it, mate.
Yeah.
Do you guys have? Yep.
One additional point on that. In my opinion, I think obviously the younger generations, juniors and teens, have become massively better in recent times. But I think one additional reason for that is just the availability of the sport in terms of how many people are actually doing it. I mean, we are seeing slightly the same thing in powerlifting. I mean, like numbers are still going up in all weight classes. And yeah, you have just more people involved in the sport, and the potential to get one people who is genetically more gifted for that is just better. It's just a higher chance that will happen. So I think that's one additional reason why we see such an improvements over the last years.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, the pool is bigger. When you have a bigger pool, the opportunity for great physiques is going up. So yeah, that's a great point. It's a great point.
Obviously.
Agreed. Do you guys have a question?
I think I am a pretty good example of what you just said, because I didn't waste 2 years of training just biceps. I started with a push-pull legs plan when I was 13 years old and started benching and squatting and deadlifting right away. And I think I nailed my nutrition pretty fast, and I think that I could use 6 years of my from 13 to 19 years old pretty productively. So I think that there will be many monsters coming up also in the teen classes.
Yeah,
Because there are better genetics than me. So
you can see it as well. There's some fucking freaky dudes on Instagram, and you just see like a 16-year-old kid like overhead pressing the 50-kilo dumbbells, and you're like,
fuck, man.
Either this guy's gonna need like a shoulder replacement by 19, or he's gonna have huge fucking delts.
I don't know if you saw the guy who won the junior class in Switzerland. So Ramon won the teen class, and the guy who won the junior class, he's absolutely massive. His back is
was he a bald guy?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
he was in Worlds as well.
Yeah.
So, and this guy is doing basically a lot wrong, but he still looks like that. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, he just looked like a guy that could do everything wrong and still could be massive. I saw him backstage. Like, he wasn't the hardest of dudes in terms of condition, but he was just massive. Like, his back is just colossal. Yeah, huge. Crazy stuff.
He's like a walking lat.
Yeah, he is.
So you talked about you being a coach, and since you got a lot of experience in coaching, we would like to know from you what do you think are the most important attributes a coach should bring with?
So I think you already covered one of the biggest ones, which is the experience level of the coach, and how in the trenches they are. By in the trenches, I mean like at the shows and immersed in bodybuilding, because I see a lot of coaches at the moment. They will say someone has certain level of potential, like let's say they say, oh, he will go pro at this point, or he has a pro potential, and they have not even been to a show where there is any pros, or they have not been to worlds where the pro cards are given. And that ability to have, I think what I call it is like the coaching eye. The coaching eye is just one of the most important things. And that's what I've always thought as well. Like, I've never thought any differently. And that's why I maybe haven't been one of those coaches that consistently references study after study after study. When I look at like piecing together informative packages for either a check-in or for a post or anything like that, I don't dive too deep into that, because I think that it provides value, but not as much as being in the trenches and analyzing physiques and knowing the ins and outs of the sport a little more. So like, I look up to a lot of people when it comes to coaching. Cliff Wilson's one of probably the biggest guys look up to, and I like to think that he doesn't look too deep into those kind of things either. He just really focuses on, he locks down hard on the things that he's good at. And that's what I've always thought in terms of coaching. Like, if you're really good at like looking at the research and applying it, or you're really good at exercise mechanics or something like that, like, go in on that. And that could be your quality point, 100%. Never been great at those two things. I also don't really enjoy them that much. So I don't go hard on those things. I go hard on the things that I love, which is analyzing physiques, knowing when to do something, having that coaching eye. And also a big thing that I love is building relationships and rapport with clients, and not just being a person that almost makes them look like a number or another subject in my studies of the human body. I just like to build a relationship where they can like me, they can trust me, and they can understand that the decision I'm making doesn't have to be backed up by 1,000,001 different things. It can just be backed up by me saying that it's probably the right thing to do. I think secondly to that is when you're developing the coaching eye, you have to be prepared to be making mistakes and be prepared to accept that you're wrong. And a lot of coaches have a really hard time at this, really hard time. Like, a lot of people get into coaching because they really like being their own boss, and they really like calling the shots and being a leader, not a follower. But then when someone tells them that they're wrong, or they've done something incorrectly, or they realize that they're wrong, their ego gets hurt and they can't handle it, and then they don't improve, and they do the same things wrong again and again. And they make the same issues with clients again and again. And they will not progress much further, because they're not an analytical coach. They're not someone that's making sure that what they do wrong, that they don't do wrong again. So, and I've made mistakes, and I will do things differently next time with the things that I've done wrong. And that critical analysis of your process is something that I always look to do as a coach. In terms of outside of that, I think professionalism across the board is something that's lacking a lot in the coaching world at the moment, unfortunately. And it comes down to people's lack of awareness and stupidity. I hate to rant about it, but there's a lot of dirty, grim coaches out there that treat people really poorly when it comes to, especially male to female clients. So there's a lot of bad coaching out there when it comes to that side of things. So something that I never, ever want to be known for is being that kind of horrible coach that doesn't do things right and is not professional. So professionalism across the board is something that I aim to consistently do, because you don't see any top coaches that will be coaches for a long time and have like really high levels of respect from the clients, do that kind of thing. So that's something that I think is really important. Unfortunately, it's becoming pretty common in the industry, because it is like a hard to say what it is. It's like there is almost like an attractive or sexual element to bodybuilding, in the sense that people can find physiques attractive, and that balance between being a coach and being someone that finds a client attractive is something that a lot of people fuck up. And not a lot of people are prepared to say that, but a lot of people do fuck it up big time. And I've seen it happen to a lot of people. And it's just something that I never want to happen to my business. So that's something that I think as male coaches, you need to be really careful of. Obviously, it's different in the female world, because my partner Danny, my girlfriend Danny is a coach as well. It's very different in the female industry, because they're just coaching females. So that problem is much less common. But in the male to female coaching industry, this problem seems to be consistently arising with some coaches. Mainly over here in the UK. I'm not sure about your country, but over in the UK, there's been a few issues. So yeah, there's that. And besides that, I think that's pretty much everything I would like to see in a coach and in myself. And I like, this is probably one of the reasons why I don't have a coach, is that the rarity of a good one is slim. There's always something that I think, I look at a coach and I think, well, I really like what he does here, but I also really don't like what he does here. And I've heard this, or I've heard that. And like, just, this is a very bitchy industry, unfortunately. And I think you've got to be overprotective when it comes to your reputation, like really overprotective, because a lot of people are willing to like talk crap about you basically behind your back. And it's better off just to be really safe than to be sorry about something. One more thing as well is just being really honest with your clients. So don't just blow smoke up people's asses is one of the biggest things that I try and do. The worst thing you can have is like you're saying to someone, you will be really hard to beat, or you will win next year. No one will beat you in 2021.
And
like,
guess what?
That's just absolute horseshit. Like, you
Absolutely.
don't know anything about who's going to turn up. So saying someone has potential is completely different to saying you will win, or no one will beat you, or you will be unbeaten, you know. And it's a very, very difficult one, because you obviously want to give them motivation. Motivation is a good thing to have and to give to a client. I'm lucky a lot of my clients don't really need motivation. They may need a little bit of a kick up the bum sometimes, but they don't really need a lot of motivation, because they're very intrinsically motivated by themselves and their own goals. But you just want to make sure that when the show comes around, that they're happy with the end result and they're pleased with what they have achieved, in the sense that they're not coming away with like a negative mindset, and that they already hate you because you promised them a win and they got third place, you know.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think is really important. Yeah.
I mean, you said that right. I mean, you have to be, in some ways, as a coach, you have to motivate your athlete. But on the other side, you have to be honest. You know, don't give them wrong promises, like, because afterwards, you know, guess what? I mean, if you're not an honest coach, I guess that will be the last coaching you've done to that client.
Yep. Yeah,
Did you ever experience a relationship with a client, and you don't have to tell names, of course, but
Sure.
where you had troubles in terms of being honest to each other, and how have you solved that, if something like that happened? Or not honesty, maybe just you the relationship wasn't as right, you know, was just something wrong between.
Just didn't click well, I think you mean that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, for sure. I've had a few situations like that where the coach-client relationship just doesn't quite match. And that's, I think, something really important when it comes to a client deciding to work with you. They really need to be someone that follows you for quite a while and gets to learn what you're like and who you are. And that's why I don't really advertise I haven't advertised my coaching in years, because I don't need to, and two, sometimes at this level of coaching where I can be a bit more picky with clients, it plays prudence to be that person that someone follows for a year and then decides they want to join up coaching, so that then the relationship's almost already built, because they feel like they already know me, because they've followed me on Instagram for a long time, they've read my posts, they've followed my stories, they know who I am, they've listened to the podcast. So when they get that first check-in, it's not like a culture shock. They know who I am. So yeah, that's something that I think is a very important thing when it comes to coaching, is the clients having that know, like, and trust before they sign up, for sure.
All right. Interesting. Really interesting.
So I think you guys wanted to know a little bit more about your programming. So I obviously know a lot about your programming and took a lot from it, learned a lot from it. So I think I'll just head over to you guys that you can ask your questions.
Yeah, maybe just give us some insight in what do you first think about if you set up a new program, or if you think about a split, you know. Some keywords for me would be like lower backloading, making sure rest days are set appropriately, stuff like that. And then how do you handle an interplay between frequency, intensity, and volume?
Sure. So I think a lot of the clients that come to me, normally 9 out of 10 times, they're training too frequently with too much volume. And just a lot of the time that seems to be the case. A lot of the time they will say, well, I'm recovering from this amount, so it's fine. But then you look at their lifts and you think they should be stronger, or they could be stronger. And you see their performance across 3 sets or 4 sets, and you think, wouldn't that be much better if they did just 2 sets, and they did everything they could in those 2 sets, and they drove those 2 sets up, as opposed to having that mental approach to 3 or 4 sets and thinking, I've got 3 or 4 here, I better leave a few in the tank on the first 2, because The last two, I'm going to be really gassed to try and maintain previous week's numbers. And this is something that I've adapted for a long, long time. I only first was aware of this kind of training in 2017, this very start of 2017, when I really started following Jordan Peters. I just didn't make sense to me. It just didn't make sense. I was like, I'm going to do less and build more muscle. That just didn't make sense in my head. But when you start to understand the basic mechanisms of hypertrophy, and you start to really think, okay, what is really the main driver here? What is common amongst big people? And that is strength. That is weight on the bar. That is loads that are being shifted. And at that time, I was strong. In 2017, I was relatively strong, and I was strong across sets. So I'd do maybe 4 sets or 5 sets of squatting, and I could maintain my numbers across 4 or 5 sets. But if I look back and I think, well, if I'd have done less and I'd have focused on driving up those pure numbers, I would have been a lot stronger. And I probably would have had, well, I know now from this off season that I would have had more muscle. I just know now I would have had more muscle. So I think a lot of the time I'm taking clients volume. That it depends where they're at in their training career. The main prerequisite for training at a lower volume threshold is skill acquisition. You cannot train at lower volumes really and make good progress unless, and let's say you're an intermediate lifter, you're not a brand new lifter. Intermediate lifter, you cannot train with lower volume and make more progress unless you're very skilled at taking sets all the way there. Because otherwise you're just going to end up doing less at the same intensity, which means that your overall stimulus is coming down. If you're taking volume down, something has to change. Your intensity has to go up as a result of your ability to bring down volume. So if you've done 4 sets and you were doing them at like an RPE, or let's say RIR, if you were doing an RIR 3, 2, 2, 1, then your RIRs would all have to come down in the 2 sets that you did do. So you'd have to do like a RIR pretty much 0 or 1 and then a 0 or 1 again. And that mindset of training is something that I think most of the people that approach me and then sign up to my coaching love. That, like, now in my application forms, it's quite samey. I love training hard, or I love low volume. It's less of the I'm coming from 5 sets or 4 sets, higher volume trainers. But I still get quite a few of those. And it's funny, I get a lot of them that say, I want to switch to low volume, but I'm scared and I don't know how to program it, so please help. I'm scared I'm going to atrophy. And, that's a very common one. Very, very common. And I think the best way to do that is to ease someone into that style of setup and have a balance between what they were previously doing to then transition them into something which is slightly lower total work and potentially higher intensity. Because a lot of people will say, but I can still train high intensity and do 4 sets, but it's different. It really is different when there are less sets on the table. And I know that from myself, because if I now go in and I try and do even one more set than I was meant to, that set is immediately junk volume. It's immediately, so I just feel the difference. And that, of course, may be down to my overall ability to tolerate volume has maybe gone down because I've done less of that total work. I agree with that. Maybe my efficiency at handling higher volumes has gone down as a result of consistently training lower volume. But I still think that's just a sign that previous volume was just too much. And then when it comes to like periodization, I'm a big fan of implementing auto-regulated periods of time away from training. I really do, as Sandra will know, I really do just auto-regulate these. These are not written into a program. I'm not a huge fan of the approach to basically like intentionally overreaching. I'm not a huge fan of building the volume and then overreaching and then deloading and then building the volume again. I just think that the volume side of things, the volume is the biggest driver of hypertrophy, is what those guys are thinking. They're thinking the volume is the biggest driver of hypertrophy with that approach, because you are limiting your ability to build strength and build load on the bar with that principle. I know they are, because I see how strong they get, and I know how much stronger they could be if they didn't do that approach. I just really do think that they could just be a lot stronger, and I think I would show in the physiques that they do bring. And if you look back through like natural bodybuilding history, and you look at physiques like Robert Feasey is a great example. John Harris is another great example. Ben Howard is a great example. And you look at their training, and you look at their frequency, and you look at the volume, it all comes together. Mark Oakes, another great example. And this is going to sound very bro sciencey, so I'm sorry, I definitely haven't got a reference for this. But they all look the same. They all look the same. They all have this similarity of dense muscle. And I just think that is a prerequisite of them getting to their upper end of their strength capacity and giving their sessions everything, and not trying to become this person who can tolerate as much work. They're trying to tolerate as much load as possible. Not many people, like, it's difficult because like a lot of people run into problems with this training because they get injured, and there will be a point where you get niggles and injuries, and I've talked at length with like Cuba and other people, and I've just talked so much about this whole thing so many times, about how there is a ceiling to this kind of setup, because at some point in your off season you always hit this same ceiling with a lift or something where this is almost at your threshold, and you're either like you're getting maybe a rep up, and then you're maintaining, or then a rep up, and then you're maintaining, and then your hips really sore, and then your knees really sore, because you're consistently handling that load that is like right at the upper end, which is where I think deload phases, or dare I say it, moving through a phase of training higher volume and lower intensity can be a viable option. This is something that I've not had to go down the route with many clients really at all, because not to take away from any of them, but I don't think any of them have hit their true ceiling just yet. There are people that will hit that true ceiling, and at that point, when they really, really stall, like I think, Sandra, if we didn't have another movement that we could have pulled in for the RDL and for the hip hinge, that RDL would have been, I think your RDL was at its ceiling. That is probably something that for you needed something different, or so it was either take the RDL and put in higher volume, lower intensity, do 3 sets and make them all RIRs, or put in a new movement and see how that goes for a period of time. But the thing is, when you put in a new movement, you're probably immediately going to spend a 2 or 3 week period at some degree of RIR 2 or 1. You're probably not going to go in and take that movement straight away all the way there. Yep. Reality is, even though you think it's all the way there, it's not, because the skill isn't quite there to take it there, right? And that's where, for me, the periodization of training isn't just within the meso to meso progressions of deloading and time off. It is with the movement regulation as well. So you've got to be able to understand when a movement has got to be pulled in and pulled out to avoid niggles, to avoid injuries, because you are working at a very high threshold and high proximity to failure at all times with most movements. And that is a pretty dangerous place to be. And you've got to understand when it's the right time to change something. So that is my general sort of consensus on training. I could have talked for longer on it, But that is basically my my basic thoughts. I hope for the guys listening that makes sense. If you've got any questions, of course, do ask.
First of all, really, really interesting. And maybe just for our listeners, what would you consider, maybe just give us a number there, what would you consider higher or high volume or volume that's more on the lower side? And maybe just sets per week, on a sets per week basis. Of course, depends on person and a muscle group, etc. But maybe just some numbers where you could clearly identify, oh, okay, that's a crazy amount of volume and that's more an adequate volume.
Yeah, sure. So I think what a better way for people to understand this, because a lot of people, not a lot of people count weekly sets, when not massive amounts of people do. Obviously, like we do to an extent with coaching, and people that monitor volume very closely will definitely do this. I don't get too het up in it, to be honest, because the logbook just tells me what I need to know. I know whether it's too high or too low just based on the logbook. So instead, let's take just a leg session, and just go through a leg session. And what I think was maybe my higher volume before the low volume training that I went through, and now what a low volume session would look like. So previous to this, me changing would be going in, I'd go straight to the back squat, nothing else. It would just be straight to the back squat, because that would be the main movement of the day. And I'd do at least 4 sets, and they'd all be sort of a similar rep range, and I'd probably undulate rep ranges as well. So I'd just back squat for the leg days, and I'd do maybe a lower rep day, which would be like 6 to 8, 4 sets, and then a higher rep day, which would be 10 to 12 to 15, 4 sets, 3 or 4 sets. That would be it. And then I'd have numbers. Obviously I'd still overload. I'd add like 2.5 kilos a week if I was at the top end of the rep range, or whatever was needed to progress. Then I'd go on to a leg press, and again, I'd do about 4 sets, and they'd all be straight sets, 8 to 12 rep range, just one rep range, I'd just work within that rep range. Then I'd go on to a lunge variant. I'd do about 3 sets of a lunge variant, Bulgarian split squat, static lunge. Then I'd go on to a leg extension, a leg curl. And at that point, I was absolutely fried, because I've done a lot of work. So then the quality of these isolations is now going down. And the way I'd view it at that point in my training, when I was training higher volume, is these are just pump sets. So I'd superset the leg curl and the leg extension, and I'd do 3 sets, and I'd just do a typical 12 to 15 rep range. I'd finish off with some calves. That'd be it. Okay, so if we count that up, probably looking at like quad sets, 8, 12, 50, about 15, 16 quad sets per session. Okay. So that's quite a bit, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But now turn it on its head, and we'll go in for a leg session like how it is now. So I'd always start with some form of isolation. I've now recently been favoring some form of hip adduction to start. Reason why is I think the legs just look way thicker when you have great adductors. And also it's a really nice precursor for the squats. So again, this is just like my programming has just gone strategically in a better place. Like I'm already thinking with the first movement, what does that then offer me for the rest? By the time I get to the end of the session, if I was ever doing adductors in 2017, it'd be right at the end. I'd just hop on, I'd do a couple of sets of 15 to 20, and I'd call it a day. But now the adductor is fucking everything. Like you're stacking the plates on it, you're trying to beat a number, you're rotating rep ranges. The adductor is just the same as everything else. So I'd do either two sets with 2 different rep ranges on the adductor, or just 1 rest pause set. And then that would be the adductor done. Then I'd move on to like a leg extension most of the time, because it's very hard to do this movement really well and get the quad short at the end of the session and give it everything you've got. So programming that at the front end makes more sense. And again, I do a maximum of 2 work sets here. There's very rare occasions where I may do 3, but normally it is 2 work sets. If I'm doing 3, there will be some RIR involved. It would be a top set, and then it'd be 2 back off sets, and the back off sets obviously would be 2 or 3 RIR. So that's leg extensions, and then it normally be either a leg curl or going into a squat variant. The leg curl, the same approach as the leg extensions, normally just 2 sets. With the squat, it'd be either 1 or 2 sets. Depend what phase I'm in. If I'm in a phase where I'm bringing in a new movement, or haven't done the movement in a while, or I'm feeling a little off, and that's quite often, that I'll auto-regulate the squats. I'll just do 1 all-out set. Especially when I've been training with Cuba, that's something that we always did. If we felt like on the warm-up sets, like our CNS was just a little bit fried from whatever previous session it was, we'd literally just say to each other, right, let's just do 1 all-out set, because our ability to focus won't be good for the second set, and it will just turn into a set that will just fatigue us more than act as a good stimulus. Because remember, our sets is a precursor, our prerequisite of a good set is being able to take it all the way. So if you can't take a set all the way, you have no place doing another one, really. All you're doing is just fatiguing yourself for no real reason. So when there's an opportunity to not do a set, and there's a rationale behind it, we just won't do it. So 1 or 2 sets on squat. Then a leg press variant, again, 1 or 2 sets. So we're at 1, 2, 3, 4 sets for quads at the moment. Leg pressing, similar approach, 1 or 2 sets. So now we're at 6 sets for quads, and we'd maybe do a lunge variant, and that'd normally be 1 set for us by that point. So now we're at 7 sets for quads. And then we'd finish with like a glute movement, like a hyperextension 45 degree, and then the calves to finish. So we've gone from 15 sets to 7. So that's a fair amount of volume off. And of course, it might be a fluctuating number. So it might go from 5 sets for quads for a session to up to 10 sets. So I'd say as an overall sort of overarching theme, at the lowest my volume would be, we could look as low as 6 sets for quads per week when I was on my push pull off legs off split, because sometimes I would only hit legs once a week if it was 1 rotation. At the moment, my leg volume's probably closer to, so when I was doing the 15 set session, I was doing that session twice a week, so I was doing 30 sets of quads a week potentially. That's huge. That's colossal. That's ridiculous. That's way beyond probably what I could recover from. So what does that tell you? That tells you that a lot of those sets were total shit. Because if you, I'm a big believer that if you can do more than, let's say that's more than 20 sets of quads per week, your rep accuracy or your intensity is shit. Just bottom line. And that's why a lot of people will pop on Instagram, I don't believe in like low volume training, and then they'll show this like comparison of like, you know, a certain pose to another pose. And in this period, I did 30 sets for my chest. I'm like, okay, so 10 of those sets were actually accurate. You know, rep accuracy is something that a lot of people just don't take into account. And that's not saying that these people have like awful form, but they just have an inability to stimulate muscle tissue as well as someone that could do less and still get similar results. So yeah, and I just think that, you know, when doing the higher volume training, you risk running into, especially when you can train hard, you just risk running into more volume related injuries just as much as you would if you were doing the heavier loading sets. Like when I started to train really hard, I was doing the 4 sets of squats, I fucked myself up big time, really big time. Like before my 2017 prep, I pinged my adductor, as JP says. Pinged, yeah. I don't think it was just a ping though, because I couldn't squat properly for the first eight weeks of that prep. I had to box squat. So yeah, it's an awful start. It's an awful start. Box squats are awful. So So yeah, I think you run into the same kind of issues when you get really strong and you're doing like 3 or 4 sets. You're just going to run into the same kind of issues with the injuries, with the hips, the knees, the lower back loading. It just gets high, gets really, really inconvenient for progressing lifts. And then you're like, well, if I did less, I could probably, you know, come around to my RDLs and be able to progress them more. Or if I, you know, drop the volume, I could come round to my deadlifts and progress them more because the axial loading would be lower. And, you know, I think anyone who's really strong and is managing to still train at higher volumes should just try a lower volume period, because then at least you'll know, and you'll be able to tell in your logbook really quickly whether this is the right thing or not. And then once you know, you're perfect. You know that's okay. That's added 20 kilos to my RDL in an 8-week mesocycle, and that's not unrealistic. And then you're like, okay, we're flying, so I'll just keep the same. And then your hamstrings look really big, and you're like, okay, this is perfect. So just keep going. So yeah, I think that's pretty much this topic covered as a whole. But yeah, if anyone is listening and has more questions about anything I've said there, then obviously feel free to ask in the DMs.
Love it, mate. Love it. And I can totally relate to that. Before I started following you, or once I started following you, I was really scared to get my volume down. Once I approached you, it already was down, and we took it down further. But anyway, I was just scared. And if I compare it to now, I do like 7 sets of direct hamstring work in 10 days, and my hamstrings weren't as good before, you know? So totally agree on that.
Yeah.
I think we're just in at an hour. So
That went fast.
Yeah,
That
extremely.
was really fast,
Really.
man.
I think we should end that with a listener question, which I thought is pretty interesting. And it was, what are your thoughts before going on stage? So initially before stepping on stage.
Sure. Wow. It feels like a long time ago that I felt that feeling, to be honest. But mine is just pure focus on the goal. Pure focus on the goal. I am unfortunately one of those competitors that's very quiet backstage. I don't talk to a lot of people. When I'm competing, of course, if I'm, you know, if I'm spectating, I'm talking to as many people as I can and asking questions. But if I'm competing, then usually I'll try to avoid having music in when I'm competing, because I feel like that's really rude sometimes. But when I'm getting ready for my posing routine, the evening show, the only song I'll have on repeat in my headphones will be my routine, because I'm just focusing in on getting that perfect. And I'm just imagining, I'm basically, all I'm going through my head is exactly the same that's going through my head when I'm sitting on the grid for when I was in motorsport. It's just all sports visualization. And that's something that there's been actually, of course, research done in terms of visualization, and before a lift, like in powerlifting, you know, there's been studies to say that the more you can visualize a lift, the better the outcome will be, the better sports performance you'll have, because you've done the lift in your head. And I'm sure, like, Hathor before his deadlift had imagined that about 1 million times.
Yeah.
And done it about 1 million times. So for me, it's visualization. I'm thinking about how I'm going to place my feet. I'm thinking about how I'm going to transition in my quarter turns. I'm also thinking I've read the judging sheet, so I know exactly who's going to be next to me. And the British finals, any world show, I probably know the competition normally. At the qualifier shows, the smaller shows, I won't know who they are, so it doesn't really bode relevance. But when you're at a higher level, like especially when you're a pro bodybuilder, you'll know who's going to be standing next to you, and you can almost plan how you're going to angle yourself and pose to them to make yourself look like you're better. Like I did this a few times in 2017 when I came out, because I knew exactly I was standing against. So I'd show off certain poses when I knew they were weak. Like the TAF at the British finals in the BNBF, I knew his back shots were really weak. So I really emphasized my back shots and tried to like draw attention to me in those back poses, so that I could then, the comparisons could be maybe heavily more weighted to poses where I knew I was stronger. So it's just, so these are like marginal gains that will maybe move you forwards as a competitor. So if you're a newer competitor, maybe don't think so much about all of these things, because your mind will probably explode before you go on stage. Like searching up everyone on Instagram, like, goodness, he's got a weak bicep. Don't do that. Just visualize the stage. Just visualize your posing, how you're going to hit your shots, and that should be enough to get you going initially when it comes to stepping on stage. But that in terms of me and what I do, that's pretty much it. And yes, it's a real, I miss it a lot, to be honest, that kind of feeling, because it's a very, very focused feeling, a very weird feeling, because you're so focused on something that you've been thinking about for like, well, for me it'll be, years I've been thinking about the goal that I want to achieve. Yes, it's a very, very unreal feeling. I was actually talking to my girlfriend about this the other day, how bodybuilding is such a interesting sport in terms of the fact that the actual element of the competition is so infrequent. So it's a very euphoric feeling when you are at the competition, because you only do it maybe twice a year, and then you're away for maybe a year, and then you do it again. And that's something that I kind of like, and I also kind of dislike. I wish I could do it more often, because that's what I loved about motorsport. I'd be out pretty much every weekend racing, and that would be something that I'd look forward to so much. So instead, I love the coaching element, and I like going along to kind of shows, because I feel equally as invested in their prep as I do mine. So when they step on stage, I feel equally as like nervous and excited, and all of the emotions that they feel. And then I feel very, very tired after basically feeling like I've competed about 6 times when it's a busy show. So, yeah, that's that.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Cool.
Do you guys have anything else?
No, I think we will wrap that episode up here. So, AJ, thank you very, very much for getting on here. And maybe just for the people, where can people find you? Where can they contact you?
Sure. So Instagram is AJ Morris _. The Team MBM Instagram's Team MBM _. And I have the YouTube, which is where all my podcasts are at, and let's just search AJ Morris into YouTube, and you'll find it. I also have obviously the member site as well. Training content wise, unfortunately, with the whole situation at the moment, it's a little quiet. So, but there is over 250 previous videos on there that you can check out. And if you're wanting to get into coaching as well, there's the education series on coaching at the moment. And that's at madebymorriscoaching.com, so you can check that out.
Lovely. And we will link everything down in the description, of course.
Thank you very much, guys. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So guys, thanks for listening, and hope you tune in next time in the next German episode. Maybe with AJ as well, if his German skills are getting better.
I'll be ready for next week.
Yeah, sure. All right. Cheers, guys.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.